What are some significant cultural routes in India that you're familiar with? And where does the Mughal road of Kashmir feature in your list of routes?
It's in a sense historians who make roads famous. The Silk Road was invented really by this German geographer van Richthofen. The phrase simply didn't exist. I mean, Marco Polo was travelling a very well-established route, but no one called it the Silk Route in those days. Likewise, I think I suspect that the Grand Trunk Road, the most famous of Mughal roads, actually created by Shah Suri, was probably had no name at the time. It was not thought of as the single enterprise we think of it. It's very rarely the way that the roads are made, but they spring up. There are efforts to improve communications. And I think many of the great rulers of Indian history, such as Ashoka, have made a great point of opening communications between the distant ends of their realms and created messenger services of one sort or another. Certainly when the British came, one of the things that they were most keen to keep going from previous regime was the Harkara services, the postal services, and they kept up the postal the system of postal ponies linking different Harkara centres. And when I've been reading 18th century letters from British residents and so on, the decisions on whether to send a camel or a horse and by which route, these are things that people spend a lot of time worrying and thinking about.
But were you aware that a Mughal road exists in Kashmir or of the architectural remains around it?
I'm not aware of a route called the Mughal Road, no, but I'm sure there are many. I mean, the Mughals had to get to Kashmir, and there would have been an imperial highway. Yeah. Whether it's on exactly the same route as the modern highway from Jammu, I don't know.
You spent a lot of time in Kashmir in the early 90s as a journalist in Srinagar, and you have worked and contributed extensively to the body of knowledge surrounding Mughal heritage since. What in particular do you find significant about Mughal heritage in Kashmir, and how does it contribute to the understanding of Mughal heritage in a subcontinental scale?
I'm a historian of 18th and 19th century Mughal history, and particularly around Delhi, and I am by no means an expert on Kashmiri history of any sort. But as an amateur reader of 17th century history, we all know those stories recorded and described beautifully by Bernier and so on of Roshanara and her entourage leaving Shalimar Bagh at the north of Delhi for the long road to Kashmir. We know the stories of Ahmad-ud-Dawla dying on his way back from Kashmir and his body being taken in mourning to Agra. So there were clearly established imperial highways. The ones we often forget are the ones that no longer lead out of India, because Kashmir has remained within India. We remember the main route to Kashmir. We often forget that the other main route was to Kabul, which now passes up through Pakistan, past the Pakistani nuclear establishments at War, which is not a place any Indian researcher would be very welcome, I fear, through to the beautiful garden, Nimla Garden, outside Kandahar, or between Jalalabad and Kandahar, and then Kabul. So the Mughal processional routes to their summer capitals, which went from Garden and Caravanserai to Garden and Caravanserai to Garden and Caravanserai, which were laid out often by Shah Jahan. We remember the ones in India, but we forget the ones that led elsewhere, out of the modern geographical accident that is the modern border of India.
It was during the time that you were in Kashmir that what used to be a small-scale insurgency radicalized into what continues to be a popular movement following some incidents such as the Gaukadal and the Kunal-Poshpura massacres, for instance. In Kashmir, the Scarred and the Beautiful, you talk about how the conflict and violence in the valley has now gained so much momentum and prominence that it now completely overshadows, and I quote, the tradition of high culture, artistic inventiveness and religious syncretism that Kashmir once epitomized. But in a situation like this, when national security and livelihoods and lives are under threat, where do you think culture and the need to conserve cultural heritage feature in our list or the government's list of priorities?
I think the government I think that's a good. I think whether in war or peace, conservation is equally important. I don't think the fact there's an insurgency or a battle going on means that the efforts of conservators and historians should slacken in any sense. In fact, the opposite is true. The whole, all these major UNESCO projects to save places which have been wrecked, such as Dubrovnik or now Aleppo or Palmyra, are all the more pressing in a time of war. When I first went to Peri Mahal, it was a government barracks, and they'd been armed, and it still got a few soldiers around it. But in those days, it was sand bunkers and barbed wire everywhere. And I think it's very important to keep pressure up on governments not to let conservation efforts slip or let historical monuments become victims to war when there are other alternatives. So I think the opposite is true. I think that during a time of insurgency or war, the need to conserve and need for vigilance on the part of architectural historians and conservators is all the greater. And given that the Kashmir government is doing so badly in so many other ways, perhaps one thing they could successfully do is put more money into conservation, because they're certainly not succeeding in any of their other main tasks.
A lot of people in Kashmir seem to think, or are perhaps led to think, that Yusuf Shah Chak's rule was the last time that Kashmir was free, before it was annexed by Akbar in 1586, after which the reins changed hands from Mughal to Afghans to Sikhs to Dogras, and finally the Indian government, all of whom are deemed essentially foreigners, leading to their contribution to the valley's cultural heritage being perceived through a colonial lens as a somewhat tier 2 heritage. Even elsewhere in India, this appears to be a growing trend where political ambitions are problematizing the understanding of history and thereby the protection of cultural heritage assets. In such a climate of intolerance and censorship, how does one approach, navigate and celebrate culture, especially if it's Mughal, that too in a region as conflicted as Kashmir?
I think in the same way that it's all the more incumbent on conservators and art historians to preserve monuments during a time of war insurgency, in the same way I think one should make special efforts to save unpopular monuments. I know that for a fact that there was pressure, for example, on the Aga Khan's people to conserve Hindu monuments when they came to India wanting to conserve Humayun's tomb, and the Aga Khan had to explain that the remit of his organisation was specifically to conserve Islamic heritage. So I think it's very important to preserve all periods of history, but perhaps there's more effort needed to preserve unpopular periods, such as, say, the Afghan period, such as the fort is the fabric. The guides all talk about Akbar's fort, and actually it's mainly Shah Shuja period from about 1800 to 1810 that most of the fabric of the Haripabhat dates from. And the same is true of Sikh monuments across the border. So if you go to Skardu, in the Pakistani-held part of Baltistan, you find some gorgeous Sikh monuments there, built by Ranjit Singh's forces, which are lying neglected for the same reason, that the Pakistani state is not interested in preserving Sikh history. And Gurdwara is in a terrible state of collapse. And I think it's very important that academics, conservators, and art historians should be colour-blind, religion-blind, and sort of ethnically blind. That an important fort needs preserving, whether it happens to be built by people with the same religion or ethnicity or colour as you or not.
Your very first book, In Xanadu, narrated your journey following the historic travel path of Marco Polo from Jerusalem to Chengdu. Since then, you have gone on to write several more books, bestsellers on history and travel, and some combinations of the two. What is it about travel and history that you find so compelling?
I never know how to answer that question. I get asked it a lot. I think one's tastes and interests are not things you can pinpoint the causes of, the motives of. Either you are interested in history and art and travel, or you're not. But if anything, I suppose it comes out of, I had a wonderful Scottish nanny who used to sit when I was in my cot reading me stories of Scottish Keeps and Castles was her favourite book, and I was brought up on stories of knights and armour and Robert the Bruce and the Wicked English and all this Scottish stuff. And I think since I used to be taken off by her to see castles and things from when I was very small, and I've always carried on. It's always been, in a sense, my primary way of enjoying myself, my favourite way of spending my leisure time. I go off and look at old ruins or works of art, and then in due course, while I was at college, started writing about it too. And I was just one of those very lucky people that was able to make a living out of doing what I love most doing anyway. So much so that I think really if I won the lottery tomorrow and suddenly inherited some wonderful fortune, I don't think I'd really change doing anything much. Maybe stay in slightly nice hotels.
But in a way that historic monuments enrich our understanding of history, what is it about cultural roots and the history of travel that you think is particularly important as a student of culture?
Mankind is not static. Mankind moves, and history is formed by people moving through a network of different places along not fixed but usually well worn and well rutted and travel worn paths. And I've certainly always been very interested by my first book was about the Silk Road, and the Silk Road as such doesn't exist. It's the phrase was invented in the 19th century by a German geographer called von Richthofen, and there was never one Silk Route which connected 2 points in the globe. But it is a real thing to say that there is a selection of routes moving from east to west and back again that were primary travel routes that brought silk and spices and the other great gifts of the east to the west. And I think it's you can't understand economic and social history without understanding trade routes and travel routes and the way people moved. And also, in a sense, as important as that, the difficulty of travel in pre-modern periods. It was always very difficult to travel. Moguls travelled mainly by rivers. I think as soon as you study the history of travel and the history of travel routes, you begin to understand much more about the period. As a student, I think the most revolutionary text I read was Mark Bloch's Feudal Society, which had this extraordinary chapter on communications, and it did more to bring the Middle Ages into focus than anything else I'd ever read. It talked about the difficulty of communications, how communication was certainly possible, but the extreme difficulty and the slow speed with which communication happened is in a way the biggest single physical difference between the Middle Ages and our own time. And therefore, to study communication routes, to study the methods of travel, the way, the mechanisms of it, where people stayed, how people travelled, the places that they took shelter, such as caravanserais. These things seem to be essential to understanding the society in which you're studying.
With the advent of modern modes of transport, a lot of these historic and cultural routes have fallen into disuse. The kind of transboundary travel that they facilitated are also often impossible now due to the heavily militarized nature of the regions that these ancient routes now traverse. So how does one keep these routes alive and ensure that they are not completely erased from public memory?
The irony is that while travel in the Middle Ages was much more difficult, or indeed up until the modern period is much more difficult, during an age of empires, sometimes to travel within an empire was very easy. So Marco Polo's journey, this extraordinary journey from the Middle East through to China, was only possible because of the Mongol conquest. The Mongol conquest created a Pax Mongolica, a Mongol empire which ruled all the way from the what's now Turkey right through to Mongolia. And so once the Polos had passed the boundary into Mongol territories, they didn't need any more passports. Yeah. There were no more boundaries. There were no more toll taxes or anyone to stop them travelling. And they had, the Polos had an invitation from Kublai Khan himself, and were coming on doing his business, so were looked after at every phase. So while it's true that pre-modern communication was in almost all cases more difficult physically and slower, there are occasions, such as the Mongol Empire or indeed the Mughal Empire, where travelling within within the empire was sometimes very easy, at least politically, or in terms of law and order, and in terms of practicalities. And today the Mughal Empire is split between India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Bangladesh, and a slither of it is in Iran. Therefore, to follow Mughal routes means to cross often completely closed political borders, the most obvious being the line of control in Kashmir, where if you are a nation with diplomatic relations with Pakistan, you can travel in Pakistan, but you still can't cross the border. While if you're an Indian citizen, obviously you can only stay on the Indian side of the line of control. Can ancient trade routes be kept together, kept alive? I don't think, in a sense, it's the job of the historian or the writer to keep a trade route alive. A trade route is formed for a purpose. People in two different places want to trade with each other, and there was money to be made by working those routes. But it most emphatically is the job of the historian to record those routes and to record those spider webs lost in the geography of the land, to reclaim those lost routes, to map them, to record them on maps, and in architectural terms, to conserve and look after the architecture of travel. In this case, caravanserais and the associated infrastructure of travel that the Mughals built, the whole network of Kos Minars, the road buildings, and most famously by Sher Shah Suri, but also by the Mughals, and the network of caravanserais and hammams which often line these routes.